Good evening, or possibly morning, depending on where you're logging in from today. I'd like to start this session by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm broadcasting today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We all benefit from the care that First Nations people have given and continue to give to these lands and waters. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which you're joining virtually today, including our two panellists as well. Before I introduce our session, as a matter of housekeeping, I did want to note that this webinar is being recorded. So we ask you to be mindful not to reveal any confidential or sensitive information in the chat or verbally. So welcome. This session is titled Sustainability or ESG Committees, How to Structure Your Board, and it's being presented by CGI Australia with support from CGI Australia's host organisation, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, or the AICD. By way of introduction, I'm Tim Stutt, partner and Australian lead for ESG at Herbert Freehills. I'm also the firm's representative on the steering committee for CGI Australia. As a corporate lawyer, my specialisation is governance, disclosure and ESG matters. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion today. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two excellent panellists as well, who we'll be hearing from shortly, Maxine Brenner and Naomi Edwards. Maxine is a non-executive director of a number of Australian listed companies, including Woolworths, Origin Energy, Qantas Airways and Orica. She's also a member of the University of New South Wales. I should spell it out fully, given that we're talking to a global audience. The University of New South Wales Council. Her executive career also spanned investment banking and corporate law, and she spent several years as a lecturer at the UNSW and University of Sydney as well. Naomi is independent chair of Spirit Super, an industry superannuation fund with some 25 billion in funds under management. She also sits on the boards of Yarra Investment Management, Propel Funeral Partners, the AICD and the Actuaries Institute, which she'll be leading as president in 2023. Congratulations, Naomi. Naomi has extensive experience across the financial services industry, including investing globally and also locally in Australian companies. Welcome and thank you for participating, Maxine and Naomi. I'm going to start this session with a bit of an introduction on the topic before moving into a panel Q&A with our directors. When it comes to the genesis for this session, it really came about following a series of discussions with the AICD, as mentioned, host partner for CGI Australia. AICD and my firm, Herbert Freehills, had been hearing a common question from directors and companies around, do modern boards need sustainability committees? I say sustainability committees, but actually what I really mean is board committees focused on internal and external ESG impacts. So whether you describe it as a sustainability committee or an ESG committee, that's the concept that I'm talking about here. I won't worry too much about the terminology, but I'll use sustainability committees as a shorthand. Looking at that question, do modern companies need a sustainability committee, was really the impetus for this session, which is focused on sustainability or ESG committees. AICD, as part of that discussion, commissioned some research on the topic, and our findings as at 30 June last year were that sustainability and ESG committees are relatively common amongst the ASX 200, so the 200 largest Australian listed companies. 31% of ASX 200 companies have a sustainability committee or an ESG type committee. Such committees were also proportionally better represented in the ASX 100. So the percentage there was 40%, which was almost as high or almost twice as high as when you looked at the 100 to 200 cohort, where the incidence was about 21%. But interestingly, when we looked at the spread across the ASX 100 and the ASX 200 more broadly, it seemed to indicate that size wasn't the only factor. So we also looked at the extent to which ESG impacts and stakeholder interests were represented at board level. And that suggested that roughly half of the ASX 200 expressly acknowledged ESG and stakeholder type interests in their board charters. Some of the specific stakeholder groups mentioned were community at 28%, employees at 26%. And I should say there, we didn't include examples such as talking about employee human resources policies or remuneration practices. It was really more around employee interests as a cohort, and suppliers at 8%. Areas of impact included environment at 38%, social impact broadly at 18%, and modern slavery at 4%. The survey data was pretty clear that boards are actively engaged with ESG, especially environmental issues, and that they're expressly building those considerations into their mandates. So the purpose of this session is really to unpick how do they go about doing that, and to look at some of the structures which might support that. If we can jump to the third slide, I think it is, Slide Master, which has a map of board and committee accountabilities. That would be great. While we do that, I think it's the slide which follows our, yes, that's the slide, got it. One of the ways, and I sort of alluded to this in some of the statistics I was talking about, one of the ways in which companies address ESG issues or integrate ESG issues into board deliberations is through the existing board and committee structures that they have. So that's one approach that I sort of wanted to touch on at the outset. ESG is obviously exceptionally broad and has touch points across a number of existing board accountabilities. You can see some of them on the screen at the moment, just mapping across different common areas. I should say in Australia, there is a lot of variability in the way that boards structure their committees. They vary quite a bit from company to company, but there are some common ones, or some common areas which are recommended by the ASX Corporate Governance Council in their if not, why not principles and recommendations. They're set out on the screen, so audit, risk, nominations, and remuneration. Those committees might be combined in some cases, they might be combined with other areas as well, but as a base case, it gives a good snapshot. Mapping ESG to some of these accountabilities shows the way in which existing board and committee structures may be able to support ESG. While the focus of today's session is a bit broader than climate only, the same is also true if you were to look at climate governance on a standalone basis, and the way that it maps to different board and committee structures. You'll see on screen some of the different hubs of activity across these committees and in the board. You're sort of starting with the board. You have the board, which covers the extent to which it feeds into strategy and is governed. It covers the extent to which ESG feeds into strategy and the way that ESG is governed across the business. There's also audit, covering reporting and assurance, both in terms of financial impact, but also in terms of broader reporting. There's risk, such as identifying and managing ESG risk areas. There's nominations, looking at board composition and skills. There's also people or remuneration, where it might include conduct, behaviours, alignment with remuneration through ESG-linked KPIs, for instance. While this diagram and the research gives a very listed company view of the world, actually a lot of larger unlisted businesses and NGOs will have similar committee structures embedded as well. So the learnings have broader application than just the ASX. The alternative approach, which I mentioned was adopted by about a third of the ASX, is to create a new committee to help support ESG. If we could jump along to the next slide, that would be great. The question is, why would companies do that? Well, some of the reasons are set out on screen, but at a high level, some of the drivers might be things like workload, bringing a consistent view to ESG across the business, and across the committees in particular, to build capability as well and expertise. There's also a potential role in supporting the board in understanding and navigating some of the stakeholder interests as well, or the stakeholder landscape. You can see the diagram in front of you, but ESG obviously has a very broad pool of stakeholder groups and interests, as well as some of the ones I mentioned earlier in terms of the statistics from the AICD's research. There's also government, regulators, customers, employees. There's also increasingly nuanced expectations from some investor groups. And then community groups, NGOs and activist groups are also increasingly seeking to engage with companies on their ESG strategies, especially around climate and energy transition. Triangulating this feedback can be a considerable workload for boards. So in that context, potentially there might be a role for committees in helping triangulate the feedback and navigate some of the differing views or perspectives from some of these groups, which can often be single issue and need to be reconciled with other areas as well. If we can jump to the next slide, please, that would be great. So in terms of what we're seeing around ESG and sustainability committees, set out on screen is a visualization of how it might operate in practice. A couple of things on this diagram. Firstly, you'll notice that the committee runs alongside the breadth of the existing board structures. This is intended to capture the idea that a sustainability committee would have touch points across a breadth of existing board and committee accountabilities. So it's the role it plays in supporting or linking in with other areas of accountability or doing the legwork aspect. The second thing you might notice if you have a particularly good attention to detail is that some of the accountabilities have shifted a little bit as well and been switched to a higher level. This recognises that idea that a committee might support with the legwork. So having a very active oversight engagement role on different aspects of ESG and sustainability, with the output then feeding into some of the existing committee structures, whether that be reporting or risk management systems, which sort of sit in the core accountabilities of other committees. An example of this might be a sustainability committee overseeing the drafting of a climate report, with the overall corporate reporting process and suite then being overseen by the audit committee and recommended to the board for approval. I might leave it there in terms of background on some of the nuts and bolts structures that we're going to be talking about, so we can move on to the panel. I don't want to preempt any of the valuable insights that I'm sure our directors are going to be sharing. But suffice to say, creating a committee and the structural part, which I've just stepped through, is probably, in a way, the easiest part of it. The real questions which are difficult for directors and boards to grapple with are how to implement it in practice. So what will the specific remit of the committee be, and what sorts of things will it cover? What will composition look like? How will it operate in practice in terms of interacting with different committees? And importantly, how does it compare to other approaches, including the status quo, which may be integration of ESG into some of the existing structures in the board and across the committees? So I might leave it there in terms of introduction, and we can move now to our panel. Maxine, Naomi, welcome, and thank you for agreeing to share your insights on how board structure might support ESG, and having regard to the focus of the Climate Governance Initiative to climate in particular. But I think it does make sense for us to be talking about this across ESG to the extent that we can, given some of the interactions between climate and other areas, and given that often the governance structures will be holistic, or at least need to be supportive across different ESG areas as well. So to move into the questions, I might put this first question to Naomi. From an asset owner perspective, what are the main ESG issues that your boards are focused on?
Thank you, Tim, and hi, Maxine, and everybody. That's a really interesting question. If we look at historically, you know, the main focus recently, of course, it's been all around climate risk. But more recently, there's been a sort of large addition of things that we've directly engaged with companies about. And, you know, those are things like accounting for nature, modern slavery, sexual harassment, and so on. I think the risk is that it starts to sound like a long grab bag of individual lists. But I think I would probably summarize it as asset owners, we want to work with companies to ensure that they're behaving and acting in a way that's, you know, ethical, legal, and sustainable, and takes account of the particular risks for them. So for some of the companies that we're engaging with, climate risk is absolutely the biggest issue they're dealing with. But for others, it may actually be, you know, are their employees being paid appropriately, or is sexual harassment being dealt with in the workforce? For us, the pressures that we face, if I had to be honest with you, 99% of the ESG related queries that we get from our members, so investors in our super funds or pensions or funds management, are totally about climate risk, and they're all about divestment versus engagement. So those are the things that consumers are incredibly focused on, and that's 99% of the queries to our call centres. And what we are trying to do is have an education campaign with our members and consumers to help them understand why we engage rather than divest, and what the issues are that we're dealing with hand in hand with the companies that we're investing in.
That's really interesting. I wonder if you might just elaborate a little bit around what that education campaign involves in practice. Is it a lot of member material being published, or is there a more hands-on approach to the way you're structuring your products and things like that as well, or your investment options, I should say?
What we're trying to do with our members is actually teach them a story, because the kind of knee-jerk reaction, particularly with young members, young people in Australia, is they want to hear a story about divestment, for example, from fossil fuels, and that's where their interest in climate change starts and finishes. And I think that, and therefore they have frustration with the way that we engage with the companies that we invest in. So our absolute challenge is to tell them the story about the investments that are required for a transition to a carbon-free economy in the future, and the way that we engage with our investee companies and take them on that journey with us. So this is a massive thing from a kind of funds manager or super fund thing that crosses all of our committees, is how do we engage with our customers and take them on the journey to understand how and why we do engagement, you know, with Maxine's companies, for example.
In terms of the way it sits across the board in different committees, I might use that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about different possible structures. I wondered, if I could hear from each of you, you obviously both sit on a number of different boards. Do you have any reflections on what works well in practice? And ideally, you might talk a little bit about some of the different structures that your boards have as well as part of that. Maxine, I might start with you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Naomi, and welcome everyone to this panel session. Look, there are a lot of different structures. Some boards, or many boards, don't have sustainability yet as a separate committee or part of a separate committee. It's dealt with at a board level, and I think the overarching comment at the moment is there's no one size fits all. It really is a function of the size of your board, oftentimes the industry in which your board is operating, the types of stakeholders that company has. In my cases, my boards are very large, and the types of ESG issues that come up in my boards tend to be the whole list with different emphases. So obviously with Origin, with the energy transition, it's absolutely core and centred to who we are. Similarly with Qantas, with sustainable aviation fuel, I mean, this is a fundamental part of our growth. So what works well in practice? If I take a large company with multiple ESG issues, I think what's always important to remember is that there are different types of issues that are appropriate for different forums. So the core ESG strategy has to be really effective, well integrated into the corporate strategy. They have to work hand in glove. And so to that extent, you need the board setting targets, setting expectations, values, etc., around the corporate strategy, and of course, aligned to that, the sustainability or ESG strategy. And that's absolutely appropriate. A lot of the decisions that the board has to make require quite detailed thinking behind them. And oftentimes, I mean, particularly, for example, in Origin's case, you've got very detailed climate modelling and so on required, which just simply couldn't be done at the board level. So that's where a subcommittee comes in well. So, if you look at it, some of the structures are that the real strategic sustainability issues reside with the board, and then any combination of committees might hold the sustainability. Interestingly, all of my companies happen to have their sustainability committee joined with the safety committee. Now that's just it seemed a natural alignment in each of my companies. All of those companies, or most of those companies, have separate risk committees. Some of the risks are looked at in the risk committee, some of the verification is looked at in the audit committee, but the hub for sustainability discussion is in the sustainability and safety committee. And that's worked well for us, but I would absolutely say that it really depends on all of the other factors that I mentioned before.
That's certainly a model that I've seen quite a bit from a external advisor perspective, where there has been a safety committee, or it might have been even a bit broader as a health, safety, environment committee, but focused very much on environmental compliance as part of that. And then those committees have been broadened out to include more substantive discussion around ESG strategy, or how ESG links into strategy, I should probably say, to your point earlier. Naomi, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how your boards approach ESG and how ESG fits into your board structures.
Sure. I think the first thing is I would totally agree with Maxine that in order for the response to ESG to be authentic, which I think is crucial, it has to reside with the full board, and it has to be an agenda item where you actually set out what your core beliefs are. If there are ESG things that your board doesn't actually support or believe, it's incredibly important, and as ASIC would tell you, illegal not to kind of greenwash it. You just have to face into that and communicate with your investors about what you do believe. So I think for authenticity, the board needs to own it. It's horses for courses after that. Most of my companies are small and medium-sized companies. In fact, none of them have a sustainability committee, but all of them have ESG and sustainability as a standing item on their agendas. And particularly, for example, within financial services, the investment committee will do a huge amount of the heavy lifting around ESG, because that's where we're interacting with our investee companies and kind of at the front face of engagement with investors about their views. However, the risk committee will have a very significant, and in fact, many of the core risks in the risk appetite statement will be around ESG tolerances and preparing for various either physical or financial climate-related risks and so on, and obviously, employee safety, sexual harassment, and so on. Then there'll be, an audit committee. There will be stuff around financial sustainability reporting and TCFD, and so on. So I don't think you need to have a sustainability committee as a small or medium-sized company. I do think that pretty much any kind of mid-sized company needs to have a locus of expertise within the team, within ExCo. So whether it's a head of ESG within your team or somebody who reports into somebody, I think you need a centre of excellence within the staff, but not necessarily a separate board committee.
Mm. Just on this point around size, and also linking to Maxine's point around the level of work required on some of these topics. One of the areas where I think there is a lot of complexity is in the stakeholder landscape, which I mentioned in some of the opening remarks. A question for you, Naomi, I'd be keen to get your opinion on whether or not, as an asset owner, you think there are increasing investor expectations around ESG issues.
Yes, but I would also say that companies themselves are placing a growing emphasis on these things. And I think that's good, because I think the minute ESG is just something where, AXI or proxy advisor firms are knocking at your door, then I think it's kind of a bit broken. And I think maybe that was the case a few years ago. But these days, I would say that companies are actually leading and driving this themselves. Of course, the accounting standards are changing things as well. So now, as we enter into various sustainability accounting standards and compulsory TCFD reporting, accounting for nature, legislation around modern slavery, companies have leapt on this and grabbed it. So I don't actually think that the real driver for change and for consideration of ESG issues is the institutional investor community anymore. I think all large companies are right across this, and it's core business now, because they understand, the risks that the globe is facing, and we all, have kids and grandkids and are facing into it.
Mm. And Maxine, I wonder if you might give a perspective on some of the challenges that you face in navigating different stakeholder groups.
Yeah, look, I think Naomi's absolutely right. It is coming from the company, and the company is really owning it. I think the challenges are because of the multiplicity of stakeholder groups who have interests in this area. So on the one hand, you have investors, some of whom are long-term investors, some of whom are short-term investors. The long-term investors tend to be very supportive. They understand, the difficulties of a lot of particularly climate planning, and because it will require technology that simply hasn't been developed yet. So they understand the tensions around, setting targets and doing that. And really what they look for is reasonable assumptions and a set of, a methodology which is robust so that people can understand how a company could come to that view. So that's largely the investor group, and we've found, that is very much aligned with the way we, as a company, look at it. But then you also have a whole bunch of different stakeholders, be they employees, be they consumers, be they communities, be they activist groups, or be they single issue groups, and that they bring in a different set of challenges, because there is just oftentimes there's just one objective there. And navigating shareholder and stakeholder expectations is oftentimes about balancing the trade-offs that the company has to make to ensure that its sustainability strategy is balanced and is supportive of the corporate strategy and supportive of the wider sustainability of the group. So, for example, an activist group could want you not to use any fossil fuels immediately. Now, obviously, in a company like, Qantas, for example, that's going to be difficult to do in the next 3 months, given the state of research and technological development into sustainable aviation fuels and their availability. So while we're all on the same page, and Qantas is doing an amazing job, if I can plug them, on really moving that discussion forward, clearly it won't be able to do it within the time frame that some stakeholders might want to see. So I think the challenge comes in balancing the trade-offs, understanding how the company can best use its assets and use the technology available to meet the competing requirements, and do so in a deliberate way which serves all of the stakeholders, rather than just a small part of the stakeholder universe.
And that's a very good linkage to what the actual test in the Corporations Act is around directors' duties as well, which is to act in the best interests of the corporation, which includes having regard to shareholder interests as a whole, or potentially in some circumstances other interests as well, such as creditor interests, which the case law has clarified. But that balancing part is definitely, I think, a big area of focus for quite a number of companies.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't begin to suggest that our companies don't consider stakeholders, the wider stakeholders. It's just that balancing of competing interests to make sure that you're acting, in the interests of the wider group rather than just one particular group.
One of the interesting reflections from the recent CGI Australia conference was a diversity of views around the merits of sustainability committees. Specifically, there was a nervousness from a couple of panelists that difficult topics like climate might be pushed to a committee and not fully dealt with. I think we've sort of touched on it a little bit in the discussion so far, but I wonder if I might put it to the both of you if you have a view on that. And Maxine, we might start with you.
Sure. Look, again, I hark back to this sort of basic notion of governance around sustainability. Strategic questions absolutely are the domain of the board. And so in terms of setting climate targets, thinking about, what we need to do as an organisation to have the transition, etc., absolutely should be within the board remit. However, oftentimes it just simply can't. I mean, the quantum of work which sits behind those decisions is so great that it can't be done at board. So I'll give you an example. I chair sustainability at Origin, and we've just been in the process of doing our climate transition action plan. Now, as probably most of you know, the oil and gas industry has no agreed SBTI methodology on setting science-based targets to align with 1.5 degrees. They're in the process of doing it, but at the time that we had to put out our CTAP, there wasn't anything there. So we literally spent almost 3 weeks full time looking at how we would put together a really credible methodology around, setting those targets that we were, which of course were aligned to 1.5, but we then had to look at over 20 different scenarios which were set out in the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. We had to look at IEA, we had to look at NZI, we had to look at a whole raft of different guidelines to try and cobble together what we thought was the most appropriate. So that's a really good example of where, in that case, it was actually a subcommittee, not even the committee, because to have that degree of work at a committee is also onerous. So that's a great example of where a subcommittee was tasked with that. And we did that work, and then we summarised that to the committee, and then the committee discussed it, and then we made a recommendation to the board, again, summarising all the work that we had done, summarising why we had reached the conclusions, summarising the counterfactuals so that the board understood what the trade-offs were that we were making. So in no sense was the board in any way abdicating their responsibilities by so-called shunting it down to a subcommittee. And then, of course, it was for the board to ratify the CTAP. So I think that was a really good example of where, the committee and the subcommittee works to support the decision-making of the board.
Naomi, is there anything you'd like to add there?
No, just that I think we'll see a lot more sustainability committees being formed in the next few years as the international sustainability standards are rolled out. And people understand the volume of work required just to report against those, and for the board really to understand it. I think it's a little bit of a false argument that it's shoved away from the board if it goes to a committee. I mean, we know how to manage communications between committees and delegations, so I think it can be extremely well managed between a sustainability committee and a board.
Mm-hmm. And the point you make about the increasing workload, I think, is a very good one. We talked a little bit about stakeholders, but obviously regulation is another increasing area, and we're seeing quite a bit of regulatory intervention in different ESG areas, including climate. So actually, from that perspective, that is another area where there will be more complexity going forward. One of the things that we've touched on there for regulation, but also for stakeholders, but also more broadly, is around the idea of having a hub for work in this area. And one of the aspects that I was keen to draw out was the extent to which a committee might have a role in horizon scanning on emerging ESG issues. So I think the ISSB standards, which you mentioned, Naomi, are a good example of that. So horizon scanning and sort of understanding the impacts for businesses. I wonder if you might give us some perspectives on what directors can bring to that horizon scanning exercise. Naomi, this time we might start with you, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, I think that one of the things directors always bring is just a broad range of perspectives from different companies into the discussion, so they can see the way that other companies are tackling things. However, I would say that I think one of the real benefits of a focus group or whatever is that all boards, and we know this post the, you know, the Hayne Royal Commission into Financial Services, all boards really need and must have the voice of the consumer and various stakeholders, you know, inside the boardroom. But there's physically a limit given the sort of disparity in huge number of stakeholders that there are for even a medium-sized corporation to have them all in the boardroom. And one of the things that I think that you could achieve, you know, through a hub or a sustainability committee is where you invite external, you know, climate experts into the room, or you invite, you know, concerned activist groups into the room to actually talk about your plans and help taking them on the journey and the story, or, you know, experts such as, you know, with sexual harassment, Elizabeth Broderick or whoever. I think it's just an opportunity to deep dive in a way that you simply can't do with the full board. And then that forms part of the analysis that then goes back up to the board, as Maxine talked us through with Origin's committee.
Maxine, I might pass to you. I think there's probably two parts to the question, actually. There's the one around external perspectives and how they might be brought into the board or brought into a sustainability committee. I think there's also the one around the role of directors more broadly. From that perspective, I'm very minded that you sit on a number of boards in different sectors as well. I wondered if you had any insights that you'd like to share.
Yeah, look, I think Naomi's absolutely right. I think that, you know, a committee also provides a wonderful opportunity for external people to be brought in. Interestingly, offshore and also with smaller companies, they've sometimes brought in external members to the Sustainability Committee, which brings in, I mean, opportunities, but people have to realise that there are confidentiality issues, that they're being given, an external member will only see a small window into the company, namely the sustainability aspects, and won't really understand the broader picture. So there are all sorts of issues that you would have to consider before you did bring people in as external members. But I've seen it, for example, at the University of New South Wales. And that in that context, that's worked very well. So that's a different way of bringing in externals. In the companies I sit on, we don't do that. We have enough directors to go around, if you like. And so we bring in external experts. I mean, and in one of my companies, we have this wonderful podcaster who is really expert in the energy transition, and every, you know, quarter or whatever brings in a world-class speaker by Zoom. That's the advantage of remote, to talk to the committee and to the board on, you know, cutting-edge issues. So, I mean, it's a wonderful way for sustainability committees to get up to speed, and also to hear different perspectives. I think, you know, one of the advantages of having people who are on several boards, again, to Naomi's point, is the cross-fertilization is high. I mean, for example, you know, we've been talking about, you know, green hydrogen for a long time, obviously at Origin, but Orica, another company that I'm involved with, is involved with manufacture of ammonia and ammonium nitrate. And of course, ammonia has been talked about as a carrier, a wonderful carrier for hydrogen, a much more stable carrier. And that was one of the areas that, you know, I talked about and sort of referred it on to, you know, the other companies, and they've now come together and actually have, you know, are looking at doing something together. So I think that there are a multiplicity of views, and they're really good for horizon scanning. And I'd also say that the formal way of horizon scanning, namely having someone come in and perhaps provide a forum for scenario planning, is another way to do it. And then oftentimes we bring in the wider board there, because of course there are more people, and then there'll be more ideas. So the committee shouldn't be, to my mind, isn't a fixed organism. You know, you can flex it and you can invite the whole board if you think it's going to be something which will benefit the whole board or which we will benefit from for having. But it does provide sort of a structure from which to then, expand.
I might just pause at this point to invite our audience to submit questions through the Q&A function with this webinar or via the chat function if they prefer. But we do have a question which is on this theme around having external advisors brought into some of these discussions. And it's around the role of independent advice in particular, and a query around, are there areas where it is helpful to have advice independent of management and independently sourced in relation to ESG, such as some of the assumptions underpinning different scenario planning aspects, or other areas where stress testing with an objective external view is important? I wondered if there was any perspectives on that one.
I'll dive in. I think that the phrase independent of management alarms me a little bit, because I think if the board is not trusting the consensus views of management or their ability to source advice and put together data, I think that points to a really fundamental breakdown and shared understanding of the corporate strategy. So I think if it gets to that, then I think you've got deeper problems than just how you are. Of course, management, for the benefit of the committee, should be bringing in lots of external expertise and advisors. But independently of management, I think that's worrying. Of course, you could say, well, it's analogous to, an audit approach, and if it's done there, but again, that's not really independent of management. That's more an agreed approach to, should there be internal audit and external audit of some of these assumptions? Absolutely, yes. But management is completely involved in that. If it's kind of an antagonistic thing or whatever, then something's gone very wrong.
So Naomi, I totally agree. I mean, the only time where you would really seek to get independent advice is where there's a conflict. And to my mind, the one area that I could see in that regard would be where you were setting metrics for their remuneration based on sustainability. And so that would really, to my mind, be the only time where I would say I would, welcome independent advice on metric setting. But that's because you've got a fundamental conflict. To bring in independent advice of your management team, to Naomi's point, it would signal a much greater problem.
One of the risks with committees is the scope for overlapping accountabilities. So the risk that things might not get action promptly, or might get missed, or aren't referred out in an effective way due to some of the overlapping scope between committees. I wondered if you each might share some thoughts on how companies can deal with this in practice. Maxine, we might pass to you first.
Sure. Look, I don't think that this issue is any different from any of the other issues that we deal with in, divvying up work between committees. I mean, if you look at even the work health and safety laws, that goes across a number of different areas. So I think it's a similar approach to what we do already. Namely, you first draw up a list of everything that you want to look at and where it would go. So there's clear mapping, in relation to each part of sustainability and how you want to deal with it. Obviously, the REM committee would look at the metrics. The risk committee may or may not look at risks, or you may want it all in the sustainability committee. The audit committee would typically look at the financial reporting and perhaps have an oversighting role in relation to verification of some of the sustainability committee. But, so as long as there's a clear mapping. The second is I find it's always ideal if each of the chairs of the other committees can sit on that committee. I must say I did that with risk, but I think risk is a different beast. So short of that, because that it can be quite burdensome on the relevant chairs. Oftentimes, if I feel that something is likely to overlap, I will say to the chair of another committee, look, we're about to discuss this. Would you mind just coming in for this 20 minutes of the agenda so that you're absolutely across it? I mean, the backup to that is having common management sitting on the different committees so that, you know, the same people who are in the sustainability committee are also sitting on the risk committee and so on. So you have that consistency throughout. You know, we always report our committees to the board. So, and we do so in a fulsome manner. We don't do it in a perfunctory manner. So that's another way of making sure that things don't slip between the cracks. And then finally, I mean, there's always the formal reference to another committee if something comes up and it clearly needs to be considered by the audit committee, for example, an internal audit matter, or needs to be considered by the risk committee if there's a particular risk, or, you know, if to give feedback to a REM committee at the end of the year. So I think, you know, those are the ways that you would go about approaching it. And you know, for example, when I was doing the Climate Transition Action Plan, which I referred to earlier, I invited the chair of audit to a number of the very key sessions in relation to that action plan, so he could ensure the consistency between our financial reporting and what we were putting into the CTAP. So, you know, there I called on him. He was terrific. He came to those meetings, and that was how I sort of felt more comfortable that things weren't being left, you know, between the cracks.
A good example of early involvement and no surprises down the track through that approach. Naomi, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, just to emphasise, I think Maxine used the word fulsome in regard to reporting back, and I can envisage that with a sustainability committee, particularly, you know, when you first set it up, that you are going to want to allocate significant time at the board for a fulsome report back from the committee chair and that the MD or whoever's involved, just so that people really do buy into what's happening. And that's, you know, that's true of all committees. It's a real mistake just to have them as sort of checkbox item on the list. You know, you have to allocate time for the chairs to really give the rest of the board a very good sense of what's been discussed.
We have a few more questions coming through the Q&A function. There's one here for you, Maxine, I think, although I can also chip in a view as well. But it's Maxine mentioned bringing external experts onto sustainability committees as an option. Is that common practice?
So I think it's probably more common, as I mentioned, either in, you know, well, either in a smaller organisation where they simply don't have enough directors to go around all of the committees, and so they then bring in external. As I say, you know, we do it in relation to IT, for example, at the university, just because we didn't have the level of expertise in IT that we really would have wanted. So we got someone from the banks to actually come in and chair one of our committees. So I think that that's an interesting way of doing it. I think that on the whole, certainly for the larger organisations, people are concerned about confidentiality, and people are concerned about the narrowness of the view of that member, because they don't see the fuller context, because they're not obviously on the board and they're not seeing sitting on the other committees and so on. So it's less common, but you know, it's a possibility.
I think one of the other interesting things around committee composition, which comes up a little bit, is that a lot of the ASX recommended committees such as audit, risk, remuneration, nominations are directors only committees, but actually looking at sustainability committees and ESG committees, oftentimes there might also be executive involvement in those committees as well. So in some cases, it may not be an external person necessarily. It might be someone internal with technical expertise or a good operational perspective on the business. So that can be brought in as well. We have perhaps one final question. Would directors on a sustainability committee undertake additional education or training on key ESG issues, or would that be more of a whole of board exercise?
There are some ESG issues which are so fundamentally strategic to a company that you absolutely have to have a shared belief and knowledge base around them. And if you can't get there, you've got problems. So I think there's a certain amount of training that just has to happen. And what area that is will depend on the kind of company you are and what are the main risks and opportunities that you're facing into. That said, with the new reporting standards and requirements by institutional investors and stuff, there's a huge amount of really detailed reporting requirements, and I think it's very worthwhile for the Sustainability Committee members specifically to get extra training around how to report against those standards, and probably also some of the more detailed nuances of the different kinds of technicalities around emissions and carbon tracing and stuff that probably the Sustainability Committee members should focus on.
Maxine, any different perspectives from you or any final thoughts? I think we're running up to time.
No, look, I think what Naomi said was absolutely right. I mean, the practice that I take is that if there is a difficult issue and if we need to understand the issues around how we would make a decision in relation to that issue, I bring in the whole board for that session. Because in order for the board to make a thoughtful and meaningful decision in relation to it, they need a threshold amount of information. And so if they don't get that, then to my mind, you're not discharging your duties well enough as a director. So I am quite careful about working out what part of, I work backwards. What do directors have to do to discharge, their duties? They'll have to sign off on reports. They'll have to, and then the next question is, what will they need to know to make that decision? And so, given that, I will then bring them in, or just say, look, this is something that should be done at board.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Naomi and Maxine, for your insights today. To sum up the discussion, I think there's probably a few takeaways for our audience tuning in from home. Firstly, that there is no correct approach around this. It's very much dependent on size, sector, maturity, exposure to climate or other ESG risks, and that it may change over time too, I think, is a second point. As regulation and expectations grow, there might be greater use of committees to help support the board on climate and ESG and some of these issues as well. So to finish, I'd like to commend to our audience some of CGI Australia's external resources on climate governance. They can be accessed on the AICD's website, aicd.com.au, under Tools and Resources, and then under Climate, or by searching for CGI Australia. Herbert Smith Freehills and the AICD are jointly preparing a guide on ESG and sustainability committees, which will be released to CGI Australia members and the broader CGI network. Stay tuned for it. It will be released, I think, mid-late November, and it will also include a template committee charter, in case that's a helpful starting point for some of our members to be thinking about what the remit of such a committee might be and what some of the composition and administrative aspects might also be. And on that note, I'll thank you for your participation. Enjoy the rest of your evening and or your day.
Thank you.